Welcome to The Digital Footprint, a podcast for leaders in healthcare, public health, and education who are looking to leverage technology to solve problems and make a big impact. In each episode, we interview innovators and entrepreneurs who are solving the most challenging problems facing these industries. Join us as we dig into the colossal tasks involved in bringing a new digital product to life. Welcome to The Digital Footprint.
Hello and welcome to The Digital Footprint. I'm Richard Sims, and this podcast is brought to you by Tyrannosaurus Tech, an award-winning technology partner dedicated to designing and developing high-impact software products. Today, I'm joined by Chris Turner, founder and CEO of Moonrise. Great to see you, Chris.
Good to see you too, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. So I was naturally thinking before getting into this, like I've probably known you for almost 10 years now, which is wild. I feel like we kind of came up in the Atlanta startup scene around the same time, if you will. So it's very cool to have you on the show. And I think you've had a really interesting entrepreneurial journey and, started at least 2 successful businesses that I'm aware of. And I think what you're working on now with Moonrise is especially cool. So I'm excited to unpack things with you a little bit
Thanks.
today. Yeah, man, it's been a wild ride over the last 10 years or so, but I think we've both ended up in a good place. So
Absolutely.
So to start us off, if you would, can you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about your latest venture, Moonrise?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Chris Turner. I have 2 kids and we live in Decatur, Georgia with my wife, Hannah. So my oldest is 7 and my youngest is 4. Let's see. So I think getting past like the normal stuff that's like a little bit small talky about like my background, like I would say that the interesting thing about me is that I'm very much like a humanist and an optimist. So I'm always looking for ways to remove barriers to creativity. I think human creativity is kind of the source of all progress as far as we know it. And there's a lot of stumbling blocks, and we've seen a lot of these like historically, but even today, like post-enlightenment, we have a lot of stumbling blocks to human progress and creativity. So most of like the arc of my career so far has been about removing those barriers. And I think my latest venture, Moonrise, is so far, I think my best attempt at like the root problem to fixing that and empowering creativity and progress.
Very cool. I love that. And thank you for taking like a little bit of an unconventional approach. Like you said, that was much more interesting than just kind of talking about your background. And I think that was a good kind of summary of like the theme that I wouldn't have been able to articulate. But when I think about what you've done in the startup space, that totally makes sense. And yeah, as someone with 2 small kids myself, which we were, of course, just discussing this before we hit record, but I've been keeping a pretty close eye on Moonrise. I think it's a super cool concept. And I'll ask you later to like unpack a little more some of the pain points that I think you all are trying to address. But, as a parent, I can certainly relate to just kind of the general anxiety about your kids' education and what are they being exposed to. And so it's been something I've tracked in a more hands-on way than I might have with just other new businesses or startups that are out there. So I got to know you initially while you were running TinRocket, which you all had a lot of success with. And I think that was your first startup.
That's right.
If that's fair to say.
That's right.
So I guess tell us a little bit about how that was also in line with this desire to kind of unleash creativity. And then also just what led you down kind of this entrepreneurial path? Like, how did you end up here?
Yeah, totally. So it wasn't obvious to me that was the arc of my career when I was doing TinRocket. I think I was just kind of trying to solve problems that were really frustrating. Like I've always been an optimist. So I've always felt like I've never been like scared to tackle industries or anything like that where I have no experience. So, I mean, starting a program or a company where we build apps for other founders in 10 days for $10,000. Like that was the premise of TinRocket. And I had just finished a coding boot camp and I was probably among the worst programmers in my class. Like I realized along the way that I was much more of like a designer than an engineer, but I still had to make it through the class and, I built a prototype and all that. But when I got out of that, the reason I went into the program is I was trying to build an edtech app. And everybody was giving me quotes in town for like $100,000 in 6 months to build this app. And, I really was just looking to validate the idea and try to get something meaningful out to the world. Cause I knew like that you have to, iterate and kind of go along, especially if you're a first time founder. So it didn't seem wise to drop $100,000 in 6 months of time on something that was likely to fail, being my first shot on goal. So when I got out of this program, I was like, even I, as like a pretty bad programmer, like could probably build a basic app in 10 days because that's what we did for our project. So it was like, I wonder how many other founders are out there that would be founders if they could just, get something basic out the door instead of relying on, this huge upfront investment to just validate something. And so that was kind of the idea. And that's the tie-in to human progress is like, I think founders move the world forward. It's kind of like you're a applied philosopher when you're a founder. Like you take some ideas that you have in your head and instead of just writing about them, you try to like put them into some meaningful context. And so I thought, if we could build more companies and take more shots on goal, that would push human progress forward. And it would also scratch my own itch, which is also a theme of my companies. So that was it. We built about three apps. We built about 52 apps over the course of 3 years and got acquired in 2017. And that's when I started working on what ultimately became Moonrise.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we were in touch throughout the 10 rocket adventure, and I was always impressed with what you all were doing and the mission because, there's obviously just a huge gap, even with the best intentions of being scrappy. Like there's just a huge barrier to entry there for any actual functional MVP. So I love what you all were doing there. So let's talk a little bit more about Moonrise. I appreciate that you kind of said you're not afraid to jump into, big industry. It's like, I know part of you all's mission, or maybe the mission is best summarized to reinvent education. So it's a big space. It's a big problem to try to tackle, right? But like what kind of got you there, willing to take the plunge and take a crack at it?
Yeah. It's not any one thing. It was like a bunch of things, and all of them would have been good reasons by themselves to do this. So believe it or not, the first one was philosophical. So after I sold 10 Rocket, I started asking myself like the big questions, like what's the arc of my career, stuff like that. So that's when I kind of came up with that answer. What's the best way that I can push that arc forward that aligns with what I'm good at and what I'm passionate about? And then beyond that, like what literally is the source of human progress, and how can I best solve for that? So that was a big part of it. At the time, I think I got it wrong. So in 2017, like right when we sold, my obsession was about the future of work. And it really bothered me that at the time, only 13% of people in the United States found their work meaningful, which seemed really bizarre and still does, given the cultural obsession with work and how, it seems that the point of the education system, at least the one I had just been through, was to like try to get you a job that you like.
Right.
So it seemed like an abject failure of society that only 13% of people found their work meaningful. So I spent almost 2 years kind of working on that problem and trying different things in that space. And ultimately, what I came to find was that, most of the problems with work are flowing downstream from problems with education. So if you can fix the root problem of education, you can actually fix the secondary problem, which is the future of work. Mainly because you help people find what's meaningful to them much earlier and allow them to gain experience instead of just, doing grades and tests and whatnot, kind of these little hoops that we force kids to jump through. So that was one. Two was that I was personally experiencing this with my kids. So my son turned 4. We started looking at places where he could go to school, and we would walk into, a private school that cost $18,000 a year for him to go there. And, at the time, he could already read, and these kids were spelling like cat on a chalkboard. And I mean, that's totally fine. It's like some kids are in that stage, but it was just like there was no choice in the matter, and we had to pay an exorbitant amount of money in order to do that. So, it just kind of had another one of those moments similar to 10 Rock. I call them F this moments, where I was like, I don't see anybody else like fixing this problem. Like, let me take a crack at it. So I spent the last half of 2019 doing almost like a PhD level thesis on why the education system hadn't changed and what the bottlenecks were. And that ended up becoming a thesis for Moonrise, which was really about, like you said, reimagining education.
Very cool. Very cool. So I know there's a lot of sides of this, but in all of your research and learning over the last few years, like, I don't know if you had to articulate just like what are the biggest challenges in the education system, if you had to name like whatever it is, 2 or 3 that really stand out.
Sure.
What do you think those are?
You mean challenges with fixing it or challenges from like the parents or kids' perspective?
I think like the current shortcomings. So I think like on your experience, is it, the curriculum not being customized to the student? Is it cost, which obviously is a big, driver of a lot of the inequity? Like, what do you think are some of the big pain points, at least that you seek to address, now or in the future with Moonrise?
Yeah. So the big problems are all problems of first principles. So the starting point of schools is I think incorrect. So like one problem is that there's just kind of a base assumption that it's correct to have like a standard curriculum across the board. And what that means is that there's kind of this idea that there's a top-down approach. These are the things that we think kids should learn. This is the way that we think kids should learn them. All kids should learn them at this stage of their lives and do it in this specific way. And even when there's flexibility, like, there's like Montessori schools and that sort of thing that offer a little bit more flexibility. But that core premise is really hard to break apart. Like it's basically so tightly woven into the idea of school that you almost can't divorce that idea from a school. So a lot of people that have tried to reform schools have said, okay, let's lower the teacher-student ratio, or let's like give a little bit more flexibility in the curriculum, but it's still a school, right? And that entire premise is based on, I think, a false assumption of how learning works and how kids develop. The biggest misconception is that people learn by having information kind of dumped into their brains. Right? So that's called the bucket theory of the mind. And learning is actually an active process that involves human creativity. So if I just tell you pandas are purple, check that against like your observations and your own theories about pandas, and you're going to say, wait a second, no, I'm pretty sure they're black and white. So you obviously can't just dump information non-critically into somebody's mind. It has to go through a creative process. And if that's true, then that involves things like criticism of ideas, even at like a very basic, like young level for kids. But the system is based around like almost non-criticism of ideas. So if you're told something in school, it's taboo to question it or to say that I think I should learn this other way, take this other class that's more advanced. So the problem with how we raise kids and how we educate kids is basically a problem of how we think of kids as different types of human being. If you think of them like you and I are learning right now. We're applying creativity and criticism as we have this conversation, but there's no curriculum forcing it. Kids are no different. In fact, they're on a hyper track version of that where they learn and absorb much faster than we do. So Moonrise basically starts with that premise and builds it back up from scratch instead of starting with things like, oh, okay, well, we should call it a school and this curriculum or what.
Right. That's all super interesting. And again, I'm glad we're having this conversation because I have those 2 little kids. Yeah. So all of it's ringing very true. And I think there's just an inherent like curiosity and creativity there that can be dampered if not given room, right, to run with. So let's talk a little bit more about, Moonrise itself. So I haven't been, unfortunately, but I've driven by and I've certainly seen the pictures. Tell us about like the physical space, and then what are kids, doing there when they're there these days? Like I know there's some great resources available. Love to just get a little more rundown on the nitty gritty of the space and the experience.
Sure. So, kind of the thing that we didn't arrive at was the solution, which was, I think the premise of Moonrise is that if we decouple space, which you might call childcare, from school, like this idea of dropping your kids off in a place where they learn and make friends, if you build a different place where they can do that and you don't come with a pre-bundled curriculum that's for everybody, you can couple that with things like online learning and in-person experiences. And that in itself can reinvent the education system. So that's the premise. And then from that, you say, okay, well, what does it look like to design a space for kids? And what's really cool about that is you get into the land of objectivity instead of so much variance, right? So a ton of like almost infinite variance in the human mind. There's very little variance in spaces that people find objectively comfortable. So for example, like if I build 2 spaces and one has no windows and concrete walls and one has lots of windows and plants and wood, like most people are, if not all people, are going to choose the second one. So we kind of start with these objective design standards that all humans love. And we started there for kids, which kind of led us down to, okay, well, do spaces need to be kiddie, right? Like, do we need to have like clouds painted on the walls, right? And so like most adults, when they walk into the space, the first thing they say is, I would like to work here. Not, oh, my kids are going to love it here. It's like, wow, this place is great. It kind of feels magical. And that's because we start with those very core design standards. So, the way that I describe it is, I already mentioned plants and natural sunlight and wood, and we have like velvet couches and the air smells good, all that good stuff. But we also have things that are just fun tools to play with. And I think that's needed for self-directed learning. So we have a podcast studio, we have a garden, we have a maker space, we have lots of Legos and building blocks, and we have a giant library with a rolling ladder, kind of like straight out of childhood movies, with little reading nooks tucked under the bottom. And we're constantly adding to that soon. We're looking at getting a kitchen soon, so we can do some healthy cooking classes. And yeah, maybe a pet axolotl pretty soon.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Again, everything I see on the site and social media, it looks like a really engaging place, of course. And tell me more about like the folks on site. I think the guides, right? That I'm sure they're kind of just helping like make sure everything is, these kids have the right oversight, but obviously are very free to explore. So tell me more about them, and then like how hands-off or hands-on are they in this stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So there's been a bit of an evolution since we started. So we really did, as you kind of noticed, I kind of worked my way up from base principles and go from there. So we kind of started with just providing the space and the tools for learning. And that's almost like building a WeWork for kids, right? So the first thing we realized, I guess like halfway through, is what we had built was basically like WeWork for kids, except kids don't necessarily have jobs. So it'd be like going to WeWork without a job. And so we started thinking kind of back to my roots about like, okay, what does it look like to have meaningful work for kids? So this ties into guides, because at first the guides were really there to kind of serve as models and facilitators, which I still think is the case. That's very much borrowed from Montessori. I think they get a lot of things right there. These aren't like, guides aren't like sources of knowledge per se that are just like lecturing kids on how to go about the world. But when a kid has a problem that they're having trouble solving, or something that they want to like dive into that's based on their interest, that's what the guides are there for. Given that evolution that I mentioned, we're starting now to look into things like hands-on projects and experiences that kind of provide the exposure and meaningful work component that I think kids would be missing if all we did was build space. Now, there's an argument to be made. This is the argument that I made before we opened, that increasingly that meaningful work, like it has for adults, is going to be moving online. So kids are going to have an increasing number of learning experiences online. And, the future, like maybe in 20 years, is going to be like kids in a space like Moonrise with their iPads or devices doing a lot of their learning online, in addition to these in-person experiences. I still think that's true. We have to scaffold it a little bit better for parents. There's an old like story about Lego, where Lego started off just with a box of like bricks that they would send to kids, and kids loved that. It was like totally up to their imaginations, but parents weren't buying it to the rate that Lego was satisfied with. So Lego started implementing and selling kits to parents. So you started to see like the Star Wars kits, and then sales went through the roof.
Right.
So we're kind of like right on the cusp of that same transition, where we're figuring out what the Lego kit equivalent is for parents. A couple of theories about
it. Right. That's a great analogy. So also, I think like community seems to be a big focus for Moonrise, right? And I imagine it's not just among the kids, but the parents, the families, it being in Decatur. I think in general, there's a lot of rich community there. So can you expand a bit, what you're seeing amongst the kids, but also kind of the broader ecosystem?
Sure. So, from a macro perspective, I think community is becoming increasingly important to people, not in the sense that it's talked about. Like a lot of people say, oh, like we're missing community because we're becoming increasingly secular. We used to have these communities in churches, and now we kind of don't have those. So let's do things like build online communities and Discord channels and that sort of thing. I think those things help, but I don't think those are the same thing. Like a community is actually like, it's more like a tribe, where there's a little bit of codependency there. People really support each other. They're having dinner at each other's houses. That's the community that we're trying to build. And I think that we're uniquely able to build, both because we're kind of starting with people's kids. So naturally communities form around, where people's kids go to learn. And when your kids make friends, you're more likely to have those kids together, which means you'll engage more with the parents. So we're seeing a lot of organic community emerge just from the fact that we have a space for kids here, where they're engaging with kids that they wouldn't have otherwise. So now what we're trying to do is actually be more intentional about that. We dabbled with this a little bit last year. We have these things called Family Sundays, where we bring people together from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock on the last Sunday of every month for kind of a catered lunch in our space. That's the one day that parents are actually able to be in Moonrise with their kids. We also did a holiday that we invented called Apollo Day, which was a celebration of the moon landing, as is like on brand for me with human progress.
I love it.
Yeah. So that was on the anniversary of the moon landing. We'll keep doing that every year. And then, we do things like we stay open late on Friday nights so the parents can have a built-in date night.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of the starting points, but we're working on it to include a lot more touch points so parents can engage a lot more with each other, plan visits together, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So that kind of dovetails into another question I wanted to ask. So I'm gonna skip my intended order here a little bit, but
Sure.
You obviously with Moonrise, the kids are paramount, right? But at the end of the day, like their parents are going to make the decision, and certainly their parents are going to be responsible for the financial component at a minimum. Obviously, we know parents are very protective, as they should be, and very invested in their kids. So how hard has it been to educate parents kind of on a new model, gain their trust? I'm sure that's very delicate, but something that's top of mind, for you all throughout all this. So can you just expand on how you've gone about that? Like what's worked, what's been your approach?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think especially up until this point, we've avoided that question a good bit because of how we've structured the model and the business. So I think one of the problems, this is I think your first question might've been like, what are the problems with, the education system and school, which got into like why it hasn't changed and that sort of thing. One of the problems is that, let's say you invent the perfect school that's like literally perfect. When you go and tell parents about that, you run into things like they have perceived risks with anything new. And then you also have things like switching costs, right? So like, even if it's great, like, unless it's perceived as like 100 times better, right, which is like an almost impossible bar to, then you're met with things like, oh, well, we live here and we moved to this house and paid $1 million so that we could send our kids here and their friends are there and they like their teacher here. So those are like the kind of pragmatic concerns with building anything new in education. So from the earliest days, we were like, hey, listen, like we are a space for kids to learn. Like we lack the curriculum, which means that you can bring your own learning philosophy. Kind of like how going back to the WeWork analogy, like WeWork's not your employer, right? They just provide the space for you to do your work, right? Like that. Now, and I know you haven't asked this yet, but we're focused on homeschooling and kind of the future of homeschooling. And the cool thing about homeschooling is that is also true. The whole point of homeschooling is that the parents have control to use their own beliefs and learning systems and curricula, even if that means no curricula, like unschooling. And Moonrise provides the space in the community and the, I guess, supplemental things that they would normally get in school, but, with kind of a prepackaged thing that they can just subscribe to. So we've still kind of avoided that question, which is kind of the point. We're more like the United States than we are like the king, right?
Right. All right. I love it. And yeah, since you brought it up, it's definitely something that I want to ask about. I know it's maybe not a dramatic shift, but a shift where you're moving more towards providing a solution for parents who are homeschooling or want to homeschool, like you said. So tell me more about like what drove you to that pivot, if you think it's fair to characterize it that way, and love to just unpack like what you see as kind of the big trends there in homeschooling in general.
Yeah, it is. It sounds silly because it's obvious to a lot of people, but it's probably the hardest decision I've ever made as a founder. I mean, one consequence of that decision is that a non-homeschooler is less likely to sign up for Moonrise because we say homeschool with Moonrise on the website, And we have kids that are not homeschoolers who are still members that think of Moonrise as their favorite place on earth. And they tell us that. So that's really hard to think those kids wouldn't possibly have experienced Moonrise if we had done this from the beginning. So therefore that will happen in the future. And we may not meet those kids who would have called Moonrise their favorite place. Right. So that's been the hard part. The good thing is that I guess compared to where we started, Moonrise, I think now is legitimately a 10x better product. Meaning if you're everything for everybody, you don't have a point of positioning or pivoting against, right? There's no solid footing. Right. So, when Moonrise can be used for, and it was, anything from babysitting to the future of education, like when other people are talking about it, it's like, in what context, right? So it kind of defaults to the normal common derivative, which is childcare, right? But with homeschooling, it's totally different. Like homeschooling, first of all, that's like very much in line with why I started the company. Right? It's like we are literally trying to reimagine education. And you can't do that with babysitting, at least I don't think anymore. So if you compare Moonrise to a private school and the reasons that a parent would sign up for a private school, even with that, even if we literally are 10 times better than a private school, it's hard to get parents to believe that we're 10 times better than a private school. But compared to homeschooling, which I think is actually more effective than private schools from a learning perspective, and more assuming that we'll get into like the problems that we solve with like childcare, but assuming that you are interested in that and down for what that means, like it's actually better for your family to spend that time together and to have the flexibility that it affords. So homeschooling is great. That literally means exiting the education system, but homeschooling also means you are your parents' principal, teacher, best friend, sometimes counselor. And like, it's a bit like if you do it full time, you can't work. So it's a bit like paying for a really expensive private school that you run by yourself.
Right.
Right. And, this doesn't even get into the common challenges that people talk about, like socialization and like sometimes the stigma that comes with it that has a lot of historical baggage. So you compare that to what we're doing with Moonrise. It's like, here's a space with a bunch of stuff that you don't have in your house. Here are trained, experienced learning guides whose sole purpose is to expose your kids to a whole bunch of new subjects, right? That have like a teaching background, that sort of thing. Like, here's a community of other kids so that they can make friends of all ages, including friends that aren't necessarily homeschooled. Because again, we still have people sign up, even though we've made this pivot if they're not homeschooling. So I think Moonrise is legitimately like I will go to the grave and say we are at least 10 times better than standard solo homeschooling, right? And homeschooling is the fastest growing market in education. The tools for learning online are getting exponentially better. I mean, like AI is getting really insane right now. So what's this going to look like in 10 years? I think the opportunity with Moonrise is that if you think of how good these tools will be in 10 years and you have things like Moonrise existing, it'll seem crazy to people, like the idea of sending them to a regular school when you can do those two things together. I mean, especially considering that, depending on where you live, Moonrise, even full time, would be as much as 4 times cheaper than a private school.
It's definitely hard to imagine the traditional education system keeping up with those technology trends,
right?
Which I certainly agree are going to be completely revolutionary in a lot of respects.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So one question I had, kind of more in the weeds, but as you all shift more to this focus on homeschooling, like, is the vision that parents can be more involved and this is like partially a space for them to work with their kids? Or is it still more, no, we have our guides and this is primarily for your kid to explore and have the resources to learn?
Totally. So at the moment, I think there are kind of 2 paths, and we're either going to do one of them or both of them. Right now, we are experimenting with both of them. So there are people out there who, let's say, have been homeschooling for, I don't know, call it 5 years, something like that. Maybe the mom doesn't work or the dad doesn't work or something, and they're the primary ones homeschooling their kids. These people are basically, like I said, they're running their own private schools. So they are very, very similar outside of the work that they're doing to the level of satisfaction of somebody that sends their kids to a private school that they like, right? So their needs are different from somebody that's brand new to homeschooling or considering homeschooling who maybe like works full time, right? So I kind of group this into school satisfied and school unsatisfied people broadly. So school unsatisfied people want flexible childcare and supplemental learning, like along with the community, right? School unsatisfied people are kind of looking for a primary learning idea, like a philosophy of learning, which is when you get into all the different school models and it includes getting into things like homeschooling. So long-winded way of answering your question, but Moonrise can actually solve both today. The way that we solve the school satisfied problem is by providing kind of more like this gets into the Lego analogy again, right? Things like classes and projects and field trips, those sorts of things. I mean, really, those are learning experiences with a guide either at Moonrise or somewhere else, right? So, I mean, structurally, they scale really well. They're not too hard to attend. So we'll start that. We're actually starting those again. We ran a couple tests last year. We're starting those up again within the next 2 weeks. I think school unsatisfied are people who don't necessarily want to just immediately take full ownership of the curriculum per se. And instead of providing a curriculum, which if we ever do that, then we are a school. So the idea is never to do that. But we can provide a whole lot of guidance and we can get better and better at providing guidance over time with things like we recommend based on your kid's interests, we recommend this math tool online, this science experiment, these projects that we offer in Moonrise. At that point, you become more like a doctor prescribing medicine than you do the pharmaceutical company, like trying to invent the medicine.
Right.
So I think we'll do both. And right now we're kind of experimenting by calling the first one Go and the second one our Pro Plane.
Cool. Okay. And I know looking at the website too, it looks like you all are going to be opening new locations. So what's the vision there? Like, and maybe I'm sure this will evolve too, or maybe there's some different things you have in mind, but what's the model? Will it be more like, a franchise model where someone smart that, you all vet wants to open their own location with your guidance and support, or are you all going to really try to directly manage them? Like, how do you think that will play out?
Yeah. We put that little button on our site in the footer just like maybe 2 months ago, like open a Moonrise in your neighborhood. We've had almost 40 people click that button with no marketing, which is really cool. Yeah. I mean, from all over the world too. Somebody clicked it in New Zealand. And I mean, by the way, these are people that have reached out to me. So I haven't run the analytics. There's probably a lot more that have clicked it.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's cool. Like we have a lot of people that are interested in opening a Moonrise. So we're working on some kind of core problem there, I think. Yeah. So the growth model is really interesting. I mean, the most obvious thing to do is to just do a traditional franchise, right? Like offset the cost of capital to a franchisee, give them more local ownership of the space, and really just provide the brand and the proven model so that they can grow it. Now, within the world of franchising, there's a whole bunch of different models that range from something like a McDonald's to something like a Chick-fil-A. So on that scale, we kind of trend more towards Chick-fil-A. But when you trend more towards Chick-fil-A, then you have to outset more of the capital yourself. So that's kind of the place that we're in right now is like, what's the right blend and what's our right positioning within that model? But I don't think we're going to go the Starbucks route where we like wholly own all of our individual locations and staff. The main reason for that is I think there's a lot of local domain expertise that's really important for communities. If I didn't live in Decatur, probably wouldn't have known to get the space that we got. And then beyond that, I just think I kind of buy into the localist aspect of franchising. Like I think it's a more robust and maybe even an anti-fragile system for growth that makes it more likely to survive in the long haul.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. All right. So a few more questions. So I always like to ask, so you're 5 years in, I think, with Moonrise. What have been your biggest challenges so far? We always want for listeners to kind of get the good, bad, and the ugly about startup life, right? Like what have been the toughest parts so far in your experience with Moonrise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, it is probably the hardest problem to solve. And I'm doing it like I have a really good network of advisors and I have a really supportive wife and we have some great investors and we've hired really well. So, I mean, my first my first bit of advice would be either to not do it alone or to have like a really good, support network around you. Um, I don't regret at all the decision to go after a really nasty problem, because at some point somebody's going to do it. And I happen to love this problem. So I think I'm in a really good position. I might be the best person to work on it, if I'm the best person to work on it. But the challenges are, just enormous. So it's the physical space with kids that's never existed. So, just off the bat, like 3 days after we opened, we got a cease and desist letter from right from the start, which is the regulating body of childcare issues in Georgia. So we had to untangle that web. The day that I got that, I had to rush to get something sent to them overnight, like a letter back. And somebody pulled out in front of me, and I had to veer my truck over to this yard of a senior center, and got in an accident. Yeah. So, it's just like stuff like that. So it's like one of those things, like when it rains, it pours. Like that seems to hold up pretty well for startups, especially like the bigger problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
So yeah, real estate, regulation, those things are really hard. I think for Moonrise in particular, like we're selling to somebody that is not our core user. So if I invented a new brand of shoes, like whoever's buying those shoes, I guess mostly it's kids' shoes. Usually your customer is the person that's using the product. So desires of parents for their kids usually actually don't align with the desires of the kids themselves. So like, this is why the problem is such a hard one to solve. I think those are like specific to Moonrise. There's just par for the course challenges, like raising money. For Moonrise, like we opened 5 days before Christmas in the middle of Omicron, like a brand new space for kids. So that was hard.
Right. Yeah.
I'll stop there. Like it's really hard in a lot of ways, but we're still alive.
No, yeah. I sincerely am very impressed with where you all are at. And, like I said, I've kept an eye on things. And I think that from the get-go, yes. I was very aware, like, this is a tough space, the regulation, all of that, of course, like liability, et cetera. And then, almost everyone was affected in a business sense by COVID, but like not every business is so obviously going to hit a lot of roadblocks there. Right. So I'm impressed that you all have powered through all that. And on a happier note, like what have been your biggest wins? I'm sure there's some things that stand out in your mind, whether that's like this one kid that said X or this, parent that told it. Like, what are some of the highlights for you that have really helped make it all worth it?
Yeah, this is usually the point, because we've been through so much that like I have to be really careful, because I get kind of emotional about this stuff sometimes. Given the number of kids that we've served, which is still relatively small, compared to our ambitions, we have a like interesting, surprising number of them who think of Moonrise as their favorite place in the world. Like I hear that all the time, and we don't, like, even though I have these kind of core beliefs about human progress and that sort of thing, and that's kind of infused into our culture, I don't like sit kids down and say, here's how to think about Moonrise and here's why it's special. Right. So when a riser articulates back their reasons for liking Moonrise without prompting, which is usually like if I said, what do you like about Moonrise? What do you most like? Quite often the response is something, it would blow your mind. It's things like, and it did blow my mind. It's like, this is the only place in the world I can be free and be myself. Right. So when you hear that from a child, when that's like your reason for starting the company, like those are the best moments. Last week, one of our newest members came in with her mom, who just moved up from New Orleans for a few months to do, they're in the film industry. And this is pretty common too. Like she just feels like this is such an unmet need, and she's already seen such a transformation in her kids that she started crying like when she was here, because it meant so much to her. And then later that day, her husband reached out about opening a space when they moved back to New Orleans. So, those are definitely the best moments. And those are really what pulls you through, because there's so much self-doubt. Like, am I really doing this right? Like that sort of thing. But when somebody says that, you're like, all right, I'm going to keep going for those people, because we want more of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That must feel good. And not many people get to have like that close of a view into the impact they're having. So I love it.
Thanks.
Okay. One last question. So again, you've started a couple of businesses, You've been through many of the normal challenges, also some unique to Moonrise. For someone listening who is a first-time founder or considering starting, whether it's a business or a nonprofit, like what are a couple of the main pieces of advice that you would give them?
Advice is tricky because like it's everywhere and you have to like sift through a lot of it, right? And quite often it's given out of context for what they're going through. So there's obvious things that I'll start with. And I'll say things like, there's really good books and really good advice all over the place. Like you can read 0 to 1 and read everything that Peter Thiel has to say about startups. And you should definitely do those things, right? So at some point as a founder, like if you're really a well-intentioned founder and you're studying the greats and you're going about all this stuff that you're supposed to do, at some point you kind of run out of things. Like you start seeing the same advice over and over and things start to stagnate a little bit. So that's the space that I like to play in, is like, I've kind of reached a point where I very rarely hear like a new theory about startups and that sort of thing. So I like to play in that space where I try to like say something new that other people don't really talk about. Like, I think there's not enough said, like people prop up startups to be like this really sexy thing. A lot of people tell you to start companies and that sort of thing. I mean, I think the core of it is that this problem, like you should really spend a lot of time thinking about like what really matters to you as if you're like going to die in a couple of years. Right? Like as much as you can remove, it's not about ego. It's like, it's more like you're an artist, right? It's like, even if this won't succeed, like, what is it that I want to have stood for? Right. And then all you do is you try to like make that thing actually work. And if it doesn't, like people ask me all the time, like, oh, like, do a podcast like this. Like you just say everything that you've just learned. Like, so you've given this information for free and now, somebody's going to be listening and they're going to copy this or something like that. And I'm like, great. Like somebody else fixes education. I'm going to send my kid there and I'm going to go work on life extension or something like that. Like, it's like, it should be as egoless as possible, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply your artistic craft to it. So with Moonrise, like every day I'm like, okay, like if I died tomorrow, did I like stand for the right things? Like, was I trying to make it work because like it wasn't working in the moment, or is this what I think should exist like even 1,000 years from now? Right. So just getting to that place, I think is so hard, but it's so worth doing. Instead of just kind of asking kind of trite questions like, oh, like what's the size of X market, or like what can I flip in 5 years or something like that. Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Anyway, I hope that's novel. Maybe it's not.
No, I think that's great. And I really appreciate that. Yeah. You're not just parroting back kind of the same tidbits of advice that, are valid, but can be easily found elsewhere.
Right. Right. Nice.
Awesome, man. Well, okay. So looks like we're about out of time. This has been great. You've had some really great stuff that you've shared here. So thank you so much, Chris. Before we sign off, where can listeners go to connect with you and learn more about Moonrise? And then what can they do to support your mission?
Yeah, thanks. So let's see. The only social media place I'm actually active is on Twitter. So they can follow me at @_C Turner. I'm pretty responsive there. I probably spend a little too much time on Twitter. They can also email me, chris@moonrise.com. And then obviously our website is moonrise.com. So they can learn more about us there. Reach out to me. Supporting us. I mean, I love two things. One is signing up. So sign up, or like just like bump into me somehow, like send me an email, just reach out, engage in some dialogue. Even if you hate this, like, especially if you hate this, right? Like tell me why. I love and like thrive on like the really high highs and the really low lows. So the stuff in the middle, like doesn't usually move things forward, but if you really love something or really hate something, that's usually where the magic is. Tell me those things. And if you don't have any like hate things and you happen to be interested in homeschooling and want to give it a shot, then obviously signing up would really help us out.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on. I'm looking forward to continuing to see Moonrise grow and appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. It was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Digital Footprint. This show is brought to you by Tyrannosaurus Tech, an award-winning technology partner dedicated to designing and developing high-impact software products. If you like what you heard in this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For show notes and access to all episodes, please visit tyrannosaurustech.com/blog. Digital footprint.